It's my pleasure to introduce to you a biblical archaeologist and historian. This gentleman that we're honored to have with us today holds a Master of Arts degree in biblical archaeology and history. He's a member of the Archaeology Institute of America. In 1972, he was elected as a fellow to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and in 1976, he was honored with an honorary doctorate degree in literature. And at this time, it's my privilege to introduce to you Mr. E. Raymond Capp. Mr. Capp, I want to tell you how much of a pleasure it is to meet with you and work with you on this project. We thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to be with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great.
Have a chance to show somebody else my work.
And could you tell us a little bit more about the stone and the significance of it?
That's when he had the dream of a ladder going to heaven, seen angels going up and down, and saw God at the top. And he woke in the morning. God made promises to him, covenant. He more or less was stunned by what he heard. In the morning, he poured oil on the stone and anointed it. And said, "This is now God's house." So, anointed stone, and of course, like the book will tell you about that stone, he left it there for a while. But later on, he was told to go back and pick up the stone, and he carried it with him and put another stone up in its place. And many believe that stone is the one that's under the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. Mm-hmm. And all the kings of Ireland have been crowned on that stone. The stone was later taken to Scotland by Fergus the Great, and all the kings of Scotland were crowned on that stone. And later it was taken by the English to England and split in Westminster Abbey. Mm-hmm. But the kings of England were all crowned on that. There's only one monarch who was not crowned on the stone. That's Queen Mary, Bloody Mary. The Roman Catholics, the church made her a private throne, but she's the only one that wasn't crowned on it.
I see. The stone is also known as by some as, I think, the stone. Some people pronounce it scone, but I think the correct pronunciation is Scone.
Scone.
Yes, the stone of Scone.
In the first half of the 6th century BC, at a city of ancient Egypt called Tephanes, a wedding took place. The bride was a princess of the royal house of Judah, and the groom was a soldier in the pay of Egypt, a prince of the Milesians, a people from the eastern Mediterranean. Men who were fighters, colonizers, traders, venturing by sea and land all over the then known world. If we ask ourselves what was the significance of this wedding all those years ago, we have to go forward in time. Forward some 2,500 years to this, the Royal Abbey of Westminster in London, the Royal Peculiar, where stands the coronation chair and the coronation stone, on which for centuries have been crowned the sovereigns of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But for this story, we also have to go back in time, back to a day recorded in the Old Testament, when Jacob, blessed as the heir of Isaac and fleeing from the land of Canaan, and from the anger of his elder brother Esau, stopped in the open to sleep, making use of a stone for his pillow. And there dreamed a dream, which filled him with awe. A dream in which he saw a stairway up to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. The dream of Jacob's ladder, and at the head, God himself. When he awoke in the morning, stunned by his experience, he anointed with oil the stone he had used as a headrest, and called the place Bethel, the house of God, so that the stone became the stone of Bethel, the stone of destiny. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. An anointed stone, the enduring witness to God's covenant with man. This stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. So Jacob went on his way from Bethel, from Canaan, northwards to his ancestral lands in Haran, to the home of his uncle Laban. There he settled, met and married 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and raised a family of 12 sons and a daughter. But he still looked on Canaan as his real home, and at last he and his folk set out to return to Canaan. But on the way, an angel of God came to wrestle with him, and they fought, and Jacob won. And so God gave to him the name of Israel, one who prevailed with God. No longer Jacob the supplanter, but Israel, a prince with God. So it was that as Jacob and his family came back to Canaan, he made his way to that same spot where he had dreamed of his God. And there, God reaffirmed his covenant with him. In thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. But if Canaan was to be his home for most of his life, Jacob was destined not to die there. Away to the southwest, across the Sinai desert, lay the land of Egypt. To this land, Jacob's favorite son Joseph had been sold by his jealous brothers to be a slave. The story of how Joseph rose to a position of power in the land, of how his foresight made Egypt a land of plenty, of how his brothers came to Egypt to buy grain at a time of famine, and of how Joseph urged them to bring their families and their now aged father Jacob to Egypt. This story is well known. So the children of Israel uprooted themselves from the land of Canaan and trekked across the desert to the land of Goshen in Egypt. And among their possessions, would not the sacred stone of Bethel have come too? There in the land of Goshen, Jacob, reunited with his favorite son, lived for a further 15 years. But now he was an old man, ill and nearing death. So, as the custom was, he made arrangements to bestow his family blessings on his sons. First he called Joseph, and to him, the son who had saved his people, Jacob gave the firstborn's portion and the keeping of the stone of Israel. And when he came to bless the sons of Joseph as his heirs, he crossed his arms, so that his right hand touched the younger, Ephraim. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. 2 centuries later, the situation of the Israelites in Egypt was very different. For a new dynasty of pharaohs had arisen who knew not Joseph and his people. Oppressed, at last they rose up under Moses and fled from Egypt across the waters of the Red Sea. This is the actual spot, hallowed in Bedouin legend, where the waters of the Red Sea parted to let them cross, but came together to engulf the pursuing Egyptians. So they came into the Sinai desert, and southwards towards Mount Sinai. There, where the coastal deserts rise towards the mountains, at Mount Sinai, Moses received from God the laws which were to give them a national identity under the one God, Jehovah. 2 tablets of engraved stone, henceforth preserved in that most holy of holies, the Ark of the Covenant. Wherever the people of Israel went, the Ark of the Covenant went with them. And the stone of Bethel, did not that go too? For was it not the first of the covenant witness stones? The covenant stone of Jacob, father of Israel, patriarch of the 12 tribes. 40 years the stone shared their wanderings in the desert, where the miracles of the manna from heaven and the water from the rock sustained them. St. Paul was to understand their meaning. I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all our fathers did eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that went with them, and that rock was the anointing. Moses, his work done, was to die in the desert, but not before he had sighted the promised land. Joshua completed the reoccupation of Canaan. The 12 tribes settled, albeit uneasily, into their captured territories. At Hebron, they buried the bones of Joseph with those of his father Jacob in the plot of land that Abraham had bought from Ephron the Hittite. And at Shechem, setting up the stone as a witness, they renewed the covenant at the spot traditionally marked today by this memorial stone. Now we must let time slip away. Almost 500 years. Years in which the loose tribal federation, beset by enemies, had in its own protection to become a single unified kingdom under warrior monarchs. Saul, David, Solomon the Wise. These were years in which the nation became powerful, prosperous, and wealthy. Years in which the tabernacle was moved to a new religious capital, Jerusalem. Then came years in which a decline set in which the kingdom split in two, so that the 10 tribes of the north became one kingdom, taking the name of Israel, with Bethel as its sanctuary and Samaria as its capital, while the tribes to the south formed a southern kingdom, Judah keeping both sanctuary and capital at Jerusalem. Then, finally, years in which disaster struck. First in the complete elimination of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, and the deportation of the people to become the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Then, as a final blow, the conquest by the Babylonians in 587 BC of the kingdom of Judah, the capture of the king, Zedekiah, the slaughter of his sons, and the deportation of most of the people to Babylon. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become as a widow, she that was great among nations? Thus wailed Jeremiah. But Johanan, the son of Kareah, took all the remnant of Judah, men, women, and children, and Jeremiah the prophet, and the king's daughters. So they came into the land of Egypt. Not only did the party come to Egypt, we even know exactly where they went. To Taphanes. Taphanes, the Daphne of the Greek historian Herodotus, was in those days a major garrison and commercial center on the Pelusian arm of the Nile. Today, it is a barren mound like this, called Tel El Daphne, where the fortress, excavated by Sir Flinders Petrie, must have looked like this. The ruins are still known by the locals as Casa El Bint Yehudi, the palace of the Jew's daughter. And the king's daughters. Under Israel law, inheritance can come equally from the female line. So these little princesses were destined to carry into the future the continuity of the royal line of David, king of Israel. Did not Jeremiah, salvaging what he could from the wreck of his nation, take with him to Taphanes all that was left of the succession of Israel? Forgotten little princesses, and a stone left from the destruction of Jerusalem, the stone of Bethel, the stone of destiny. Here at Taphanes, in the early 6th century BC, the little party disappeared from recorded history, but not, as we are about to see, from legend. For now our story takes us from Egypt to another land, to an island on the edge of the then known world. Remote it may seem from the lands of the Mediterranean, but was it as remote as we might imagine? Let's make our way to a windswept hillcrest in County Meath, to Tamar Nari, Tara of the Kings, one of the most hallowed spots in ancient Irish history. Today, it is a proliferation of prehistoric mounds and ditches, clustered in such profusion that the imagination is stirred to a sense of the timeless sanctity of the spot. Each feature has a modern name chosen from the deep well of Celtic legend. But the secrets of each feature's true identity remain hidden, and they date from many different periods of prehistory. Thus, the tumulus, called the Mound of the Hostages, is in fact a passage grave, a tomb with a central burial chamber connected to the exterior by a tunnel or passage, and dating from several millennia BC. But, and this is the interesting fact, similar graves are found in Iberia, modern Spain. Moreover, there were found in this tomb beads of Mediterranean manufacture placed there by Bronze Age men. So here, thousands of years ago, is evidence of close cultural and trade links between Ireland and the Mediterranean. Even more impressive is the similar grave at Newgrange, near Drogheda, in County Meath, 280 feet in diameter, with a superb tomb entrance now restored. In front of the entrance, a later people decorated one of the stones, and the prehistoric markings they carved are those the Mycenaeans used on their tombs in Asia Minor. And the Mycenaeans are a Mediterranean people, called also Ionians, called also Milesians, men of the Scythian race who appear in history from the lands to which the 10 lost tribes of Israel were deported. Moreover, many times in Ireland have been uncovered hoards of ancient gold ornaments fashioned from Irish gold by Celtic craftsmen to a pattern based on the mid-European culture of Latane and Hulstadt, and traded all over the known world. Examples like these, made in Ireland, have been excavated from Gaza itself in Israel. Celtic gold in Israel, decorated stones at Drogheda with Milesian carving, passage tombs at Tara whose designs originate in Spain. These are facts of archaeology quite unknown to the tellers of Ireland's ancient history. All the more exciting, therefore, that they breathe truth and colour into those early legends which link the ancestors of the first kings of Ireland with two princes, Heber and Herman, who were the sons of Scota, a princess of Judah in Egypt. May not these legends enshrine ancient folk memories of the wedding of one of the princesses of Judah whom Jeremiah brought to Egypt? Was she not Scota who, at Dephanis, married Neil, her Milesian prince? The historian Herodotus tells us that the Milesian mercenaries moved on from Egypt to other Milesian colonies. Many of these are known to have been on the coast of Spain. And did not Scota and her husband travel there, taking with them the sacred relics of their people? Later, when her two sons, Heber and Herman, left Spain to found royal dynasties in Ireland, would they not too have taken with them the sacred relics of their mother's people? And would not the Stone of Destiny have been among them? It is interesting to see what account of their arrival we glean from the legends of ancient Ireland. We learn that there arrived, some centuries before the birth of Christ, a people known as the Tuatha Dé, the people of God, who were one of the families of the Milesians, the people of Herman and Heber. Moreover, they took to Tara a number of their sacred objects, among which was a stone they venerated as the Liafoil, the Stone of Destiny. There is a stone called the Liafoil at Tara today, but the identification is no more authentic than those other names which supposedly identify the antiquities of Tara. The true Liafoil did indeed rest at Tara, and on it were crowned for nearly 1,000 years the royal descendants of Herman and Heber. But the stone did not remain there. To discover what happened to it, let's look towards the most recent feature built at Tara, the banqueting hall. Once a vast arcaded hall 750 feet long, here were summoned to council by the high kings of Ireland, all the lesser kings and chieftains. And here, about the year 500 AD, approval would have been given for the Liafoil to be sent to one of the royal princes, Fergus Mór Mac, who was to be king of all the men from Ireland who had in the intervening years crossed the water and settled in the islands and coastal fringes of the west coast of Caledonia. So, from Tara, the stone was carried northwards, past the great stone chair at Slieve na Calach, on which prehistoric markings exist, which in age and pattern match those on the stones of the mound of the hostages at Tara. And so across the cornfields of Meath, through the richest pasture land in Europe, towards the narrow neck of water that separates Ireland from Scotland. Here at the little port of Dunseverick, on the north coast of Ireland, the stone would have been hoisted aboard ship. Its destination was an island off the coast of Caledonia, the island of St. Columba, the Isle of Iona. There, in the early 6th century A.D., Fergus Mór Mac was crowned, the first king in Caledonia of the line of Hermon. The visitor should tread softly here, for on this island of Iona, long before St. Augustine brought to Britain the tenets of the Roman Church, the spirit of Christianity flowered. And here came for their coronations not only kings of Scotland, but also of Ireland, and even of Norway. And when their reign was over, many of them were brought back to Iona, and here they remain, with the silent witness of the Celtic crosses to mark their faith. As the Scots extended their sway to the mainland, the stone was taken to Dunstafnage, and there it was to remain while the Scots kingdom widened to embrace the whole of Caledonia. Then, in 846 AD, King Kenneth II, the first king of the United Kingdom of the Picts and Scots, had the stone transported to a little hill at Scone in Perthshire. And here, for the next 450 years, the later kings of Scotland were crowned, the stone forming an essential part of the ceremony. William de Rishanger describes the last of these Scots coronations, about 1250 AD. John de Balliol, on the following feast of St. Andrew, and seated upon the regal stone which Jacob placed under his head when he went from Beersheba to Haran, was solemnly crowned in the church of the Canons Regular at Scone. In 1296, at the Battle of Dunbar, the Scots became subject to Edward I of England. They continued to protest their independence, and 30 years later, in the Declaration of Arbroath, Robert the Bruce justified Scots independence to the world, arguing that their line of kings was part of Milesian and Scythian dynasty of 113 kings in unbroken succession from the sons of Heber and Harriman. But the English were deaf to these proclamations. The regalia of the Scots kings, the honours of Scotland, had already been taken by King Edward to London, to Westminster Abbey, and there his painter, Master Walter of Durham, enclosed the stone in a wooden chair for the sum of 100 crowns. It is still there today, nearly 700 years later, although the honours of Scotland have long ago been returned. On this historic block of sandstone, the monarchs of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland have been crowned from time immemorial. On Christmas Eve, 1950, the stone was removed from under the chair and abstracted from the abbey. It turned up, of course, in Scotland, on the altar stone of Arbroath Abbey, and was later, at the special request of King George VI, brought back to Westminster. During the removal, the stone was found to be broken, and here are some tiny chippings taken during repair. Geological experts have been asked to compare these chippings with samples taken unbeknown to them from one of the beds of sandstone which outcrop among the limestone near Bethel. Here is their microscope analysis. First, sandstone from the coronation stone. And now, sandstone from Bethel. And the verdict? It is possible that the specimens could have been closely related both in space and time. Coronation stone. Bethel. An interesting verdict indeed. The present owner of the land at Scone in Scotland commemorates the link by breeding 4-horned sheep, sheep of a breed so ancient that they would have been familiar to Abraham and Isaac. Jacob's sheep. 4,000 years ago, Jacob, father of his people Israel, laid his head on a stone and dreamed a dream in which God told him that in his seed would all the nations of the earth be blessed. The evidence of legend, tradition, and history suggests that there may well be a direct line of descent to the British royal family of today. For Her Majesty the Queen is descended from James I of England, who was James VI of Scotland, a descendant of the Scots kings buried on Iona, an unbroken line of descent from Fergus Mór Mac, who was, as a descendant of the High Kings of Ireland at Tara, himself of the royal line of Harriman, son of that Scota who, as a young princess, was married to the Milesian prince Neil in Egypt. Herself, one of the princesses of Judah, who came with the prophet Jeremiah to Taphanes after the destruction of Jerusalem. And was not Jacob her ancestor? And was she not of the royal line of David? The evidence of legend, tradition, and history suggests that the stone which today rests in Westminster Abbey as part of the coronation chair could well be that stone which Jacob anointed at Bethel 4,000 years ago. A stone hallowed by 4,000 years of history, priceless in its silent witness of God's everlasting covenant with his people Israel. The stone of Bethel. The stone of fate. The stone of destiny. In thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed.
I think they call it the rose-colored city, half as old as time.
Half as old as time.
How did it come by that name?
A fellow Bergen, he wrote that poem talking about that.
I see.
But Petra was one of the most fascinating places. Mount Seir is where Petra is. It's the most cursed city in the Bible. 21 times cursed. In fact, the curse is so strong, it said, thy cities shall not return. The red city of Petra is situated some 150 miles south of Amman in Transjordan, which is about halfway between the Gulf of Aqaba and the Dead Sea. Our journey to Petra is going to start from Aqaba. We came here by boat from Cairo by way of the Red Sea. Many tourists come here to visit the beach resort city of Eilat to escape the heat of the summer. From Eilat, we hire a jeep to drive us to Petra. We drive some 80 miles north on a paved highway before turning west onto a dirt road leading toward the granite mountains of the Sinai Peninsula. At first, the landscape is quite flat, leveled by flash floods that rush down from the rocky slopes during the short but violent rainy season. Soon we reach the base of the mountains of Edom, and after 2 hours of driving, it is good to get out, stretch, and enjoy the view of the rugged crags, once the home of the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, from whom the mountains get its name. Hey, our Jeep is leaving us. Don't worry, it's all in fun. Our driver will be back. At times, the road seems to just disappear. I asked the driver how did he know where the road was. He didn't. He just followed the tracks made by whoever had been there before. The ancient caravans that once carried trade goods from Egypt to Damascus in the north had to traverse this desert wasteland, where water was scarce and shelter from sandstorms lacking. It was because of this that Petra became a major camel caravan stopover, having a bountiful supply of water, shelter, and most important, protection from bandits. We are following the major trade route for goods moving north and south, known as the King's Highway, a route that passes through Petra. For the protection of the caravans, the Nabateans established fort-like settlements, usually about a day's journey apart. We'll stop and visit the ruins of one such fort, found sheltered by these cliffs. The Nabateans migrated from Arabia into the Edomite kingdom in the 6th century BC, and for a time the two peoples lived side by side. Within a few centuries, however, the Nabateans became the dominant force, many Edomites integrating into the Nabatean society, while others moved into Palestine to occupy the cities vacated by the Judeans when they were carried away into Babylonian captivity. The Nabateans made Petra their fortress capital and were able to withstand several invasions by nations jealous of their power and wealth, accumulated from the taxation of the trade passing through their land. An army sent by Alexander the Great was unsuccessful in capturing Petra, as was an expeditionary force sent by Rome. However, in AD 106, the Nabateans lost their independence and became a Roman province. The ruins we are viewing now were probably built during the Roman period, as evidenced by the use of Roman-style limestone columns decorating the buildings. Water from the settlement came from a spring high up in the mountains that flowed down a channel dug to the town. The size of the town cemetery adjoining the ruins must have been an important settlement. Close by the ruins is a little Arab village that uses the same water supply by conveying the water by means of a modern metal pipe to the village community watering tank to supply man and beast alike. Animal breeding is the main source of livelihood for the present-day Bedouins. They raise goats that provide milk, meat, and skins for their tents, horses and donkeys and camels for transportation. But the camel is by far the most important animal because after it gets its full of water, it can go days at a time with no additional supply. Also, a camel manages to find fodder where seemingly no vegetation exists. Camels are also used for milk on long journeys in the desert, even to substitute for water for the horses. The Bedouin call their country the mother of the camel. Arabian camels have but one hump, and it is called the dromedary, which is the Greek word for camel that runs. The two-humped breed is slow and used only as a beast of burden in Central Asia and the Gobi Desert. A camel can actually go 5 days without water. That is, after it has been filled up, which takes about 20 gallons and a half hour to do so. There are, however, two problems with a camel. They can bite when they have the urge to, and they have a mind of their own. Whoops, there goes one right now, not waiting for his master. Realizing the difficulty of living on this desert without their camels, the Arabs have become tolerant of such independence. The Jordanian army maintains a post of 14 soldiers of its famous camel corps near the village. These men are well trained and hardened to desert life, and they must be able to mount a running camel while holding a gun in one hand. Their camels also are well trained. They can trot at 21 miles an hour, canter at 28, and gallop up to 32. For a whole day's travel, the most desirable speed is a jog trot of about 7 miles per hour. 50 miles in one day is no hard feat. We still have some distance to travel before reaching Petra, our destination. The landscape becomes more mountainous as we penetrate deeper into the mountains of Edom. For over 1,000 years, the Western world did not know where the city of Petra was located. Only a few Bedouin knew, and they considered the city cursed and would not go near it nor talk about it. It was only in 1812, a time when a Western infidel would have been killed on sight, that John Burckhardt, disguised as an Arab and fluent in Arabic language and customs, discovered the long-lost city. He was the first Westerner in over 1,000 years to lay eyes upon the monuments of Petra. As we get closer to Petra, we meet from time to time Arabs coming from somewhere and going to some place, always with their camels or horses. The Bedouin today are very friendly, and their hospitality is legend. Although mostly Muslims, they are tolerant of Christianity. They say we are one in belief that there is but one God, and He is supreme, and we should live together as brothers, a belief not always shared by other Muslims in other parts of the world. We make a short stop at the little Arab village of El-Hai to fill our water cans at the Spring of Moses, so named because tradition has this as the site where Moses struck the rock long centuries ago and water came forth. The inhabitants of the village come here daily, as did their ancestors for centuries, to fill their water bags and now modern Jeep cans left from military activity during the last major war. Their ancestors, of course, used only animal skins and pottery jugs. This spring is the only source of water for the village and for the Arabs that live for miles around in the surrounding desert. From El-Hai, we make preparations to replace our Jeep with horses to continue our way to Petra. The Arabs offer camels or horses, but the wise traveler will choose a horse. It's much easier to ride than a camel. And remember what I said about a camel? They can bite when they feel the urge. Soon we are mounted and on our way. The trail to Petra is probably the same one used by the ancient camel caravans that once brought trade and wealth to the Nabateans. In fact, 4 ancient trade routes converge on Petra. The predominant colors of the mountains of Edom are variations of red, which is the meaning of the name Edom. It was in these red mountains of Edom that the descendants of Esau established a nation that became powerful enough to resist the children of Israel from passing through their land when coming out of Egypt. As we continue toward Petra, we see evidences of the ancient kingdom of Edom, carved stone tombs, cave-like homes that once provided shelter for the ancient inhabitants of Petra. Finally, we come to the first of Petra's major monuments, the obelisk tomb, so named for the obelisk carved in the front. However, this is only the suburbs of Petra, so to speak. We have to continue a little further to get to Petra proper. As we ride on, we see more and more carved tombs and homes in the cliffs, some hidden away in shaded recesses in canyon walls. The path passes by an old Roman dam built to divert floodwaters from washing down the only entrance to Petra, which has happened on several occasions, drowning those caught in the entrance. This is the only entrance to Petra, known as the Sick. It was formed by floodwaters over the centuries, rushing down from the mountains above, following an earth fault. This defile is from 10 to 30 feet wide, with sidewalls over 300 feet in height. The pathway winds through the Sick for nearly a mile. It widens and narrows many times. At times, the overhanging cliffs on either side shut out the skyline, making it appear that night has fallen. In some places, only a ribbon of blue sky can be seen overhead. In several places, we ride over remnants of Roman paving stones still existing, providing evidence of the Roman occupation of Petra, which took place during the 2nd and 1st centuries A.D. Through this narrow crack in the rock have passed the inhabitants of 2 great nations, the Edomites and the Nabateans. Also many famous personages from classical Rome, Greece, and Israel, and the Crusaders under Baldwin I in the 11th century A.D. As the sun makes its way across the sky, the towering walls of the Sikh change in colors. These colors range from pearly white to softest yellow and gold to red and carmine. In fact, every color of the rainbow is represented in the sandstones of Petra. These colorful sandstones of Petra remind one of the desert mountains of northeast Arizona and southwest Utah along the Grand Canyon. Carved in the side walls of the Sikh at irregular intervals are pagan religious shrines consisting of stone god blocks set into niches. These symbolize the god Sorcerer, one of the two Edomite chief deities. Traversing the Sikh gives one the eerie feeling they are exploring another planet. Just ahead of us is another stone god idol set in the walls of the Sikh. The Sikh is the only practical way to get into the city of Petra, unless you are a mountain goat. And you can see how difficult it would be to invade Petra, having to move an army through this narrow, mile-long ravine. Defenders stationed along the top of the cliffs could wreak havoc on any invading army by shooting arrows, spears, or just rock missiles down from the top of the cliffs. This was how Petra was successfully defended on several occasions. However, it was being a place of safety, having an abundance of water, is really what caused Petra to become an important city and wealthy by taxing the trade that passed through their area. It was the growing wealth that brought the Romans to Petra. They wanted to, muscle in for a percentage of the take, so to speak. Through intrigue rather than by fighting, they made a deal with the Nabateans, who were then the masters of Petra. A partnership was formed that proved advantageous to both partners until ever-rising taxes on trade caused the caravans to bypass Petra, which in essence bankrupt the city. After riding for about 20 minutes, one reaches the narrowest and darkest part of the chasm. As they peer ahead in anticipation, they see there, standing out from the farthest wall of a transverse gorge, flooded by the morning's soft light, part of a beautiful cut cameo of immense proportions, set off and framed by the rugged cliffs on either side. And even though one is watching for this first glance, the scene bursts upon them as a surprise. A first-time visitor usually stops spellbound, struck by the magnificent contrast. Before riding on toward Petra's most famous monument, hidden for over 1,000 years in the mountains of Edom, the limpid, pink stone building known as the Treasury, carved out of the native rock of Edom. It is actually the tomb of an ancient Nabatean king and was carved during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who visited Petra in AD 131. The columns of this monument rise over 40 feet in height. And about 130 feet above the ground level is an immense stone urn carved out of the red rose sandstone in a classic Greek style. The treasury is by far the most majestic and most elaborately carved of all the rock monuments of this ancient necropolis. The central chamber is 40 feet square, with flanking doorways leading to small rooms on both sides. These smaller rooms contain burial receptacles. Looking back from the vestibule of the treasury toward the Sikh, it is easy to see how a small number of defenders could hold off an army, which was the case when Alexander the Great sent an army that failed to force an entrance. This view shows how the temple was chiseled right out of the solid rock, which continues for several hundred feet above the ground. The Nabateans also carved their homes right out of the sandstone cliffs. Literally, thousands of such homes have been found in Petra. In some places, they are in rows facing streets cut into the rock. keep in mind, these homes and monuments are over 2,000 years old and existed for over prior to that. This is known as the Street of the Facades. Many styles of architecture is found on the monuments of Petra. The plainer fronts are mostly Nabatean, while the more ornate are of the Roman period, often carved over the original Nabatean buildings. Only a few artifacts like this marble head have been found in the excavations of Petra, mainly due to the fact that the city was not destroyed by war or earthquakes, but just slowly dwindled away, giving the inhabitants time to remove their possessions. The only still standing walled building in Petra is the ruins of the Temple of the Pharaoh's Daughter, a name whose origin is unknown. It is actually a temple for the Edomite god Sorcerer, later adopted by the Nabateans. It was built by the Romans as a public works project to show tolerance for the religion of the inhabitants of Petra. Many of the ancient tombs and temples of Petra are located high up on the mountains surrounding the city. To reach them, we must climb steep gorges and often sets of stone stairs. And in doing so, we pass many natural caves that were no doubt once the homes of the early Edomites, whose descendants became, for the most part, integrated with the Nabateans. Many of the Edomites, however, migrated into Palestine during the Babylonian captivity of Judah and were still there when the Judeans were allowed to return to Palestine by Cyrus after the downfall of Babylon. These Edomites were later integrated into the new so-called Jewish state, which by the time of Christ was a multi-racial nation. About 600 feet above the city is Ed-Dur. To construct this temple, the ancient masons had to strip away a mountainside to create a flat surface into which to carve. Ed-Dur's huge door is some 26 feet high and provides the only light reaching the interior, a single chamber 38 feet by 37 feet in size. The facade of this temple is about 154 feet in width and approximately 132 feet in height, and contains niches for placed statuary long since removed. The unique feature of Ed-Dur is a huge stone urn weighing many tons on top of the monument. It has been carved from a separate piece of rock, and it is interesting to speculate how this colossal weight was handled and placed into position. From the top of the urn, we gain a panorama view of Petra. But watch out, don't get too close to the edge. I don't want to lose anyone. From the city of Petra, there are many side canyons winding up the mountains surrounding the city. All have paths passing by hundreds of cave-like homes and monuments. In one of these cave homes, Esau hid out as a hunter, whose descendants were the subject of a prophecy recorded in the scriptures by the prophet Obadiah, which reads, "Thus saith the Lord God concerning Edom, though thou exalt thyself as an eagle, though set thy nests among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord." Those words were fulfilled when Amaziah, king of Judah, invaded Petra in 785 BC. He literally pulled down the inhabitants from their nest-like homes, leaving them empty and bare. This series of facades includes Petra's royal tombs. First on the right is the Silk Tomb, the center the Corinthian tomb, on the left the Palace Tomb, which originally had 3 stories, the top of masonry, which is now falling into ruin. The Palace Tomb is pure Nabatean in design. It is one of the only 7 monuments of the classic Nabatean period found at Petra. Riding on, we pass many similar buildings, spanning in architectural style many centuries. We are on our way now to visit the famous urn temple known as the monastery. The monastery differs from other large temples in Petra in that it has a masonry extension supported by 2 stories of arched vaults. It's its name from found on one of its interior walls. The Bible speaks of high places of sacrifice relating to pagan religious rites. The finest example of just such a place is the one found in Petra. To reach Petra's high place, we must climb up another steep gorge of several sets of stone stairs cut into the bedrock of the mountain. At times, the path is just a narrow ledge along vertical sides, almost overhanging cliffs, where one misstep could be fatal. One wonders if Petra's newspaper had a long obituary column. It is a long climb to Petra's high place, so in several places we find where the path had flattened out, they had widened it to provide a resting place for the pilgrims. In the Old Testament, high places were generally associated with places of elevation, constructed artificially and used for sacrifice, sometimes human. The prophets of the Old Testament continually warned the Israelites against heathen worship in these places. We finally reached the top of the mountain, which is known as Obelisk Ridge, so named after two large obelisks found there. The two obelisks stand about 20 feet high and are about 100 feet apart. They have been carved from the mountaintop by quarrying all the rock from around them. Petra's high place consists of a large court sunk into the surface of the rock top of the mountain. In the center of the court is a raised offering table or altar. And surrounding the court are ledges and benches containing various size altars. What rites this place once witnessed can only be conjectured. However, all the requirements of human sacrifice are found here. A central altar where a victim was laid, as certain rites were performed on his body. A tub-like basin where the body could be washed, a standard procedure. Another pit where the body could be cremated after sacrifice. And a most important element for sacrifice, an altar basin for the actual bloodletting, designed to catch the blood in containers. It has been said, seeing is believing, but it doesn't always seem to work. Some visiting Arab, after seeing Petra's high place, wrote this inscription in Arabic: "There is no such place." Did he mean it was non-existent in his mind, or there's no place like this? From the high place, we overlooked the rocky, rugged mountains of Edom that provided a natural protection for the city of Petra and concealed its ruins from the eyes of the Western world for centuries. Since there is no water supply on top of the mountain, water for the high place was supplied from cisterns carved into the bedrock to catch rainwater during the rainy season, to augment what had to be carried up in containers. In descending the mountain by means of a different route, we passed another interesting monument. A carved lion with his head turned sideways, facing the traveler. A lead pipe conveying water from a small spring above to refresh the thirsty pilgrims on their way to the high place. Even at this elevation, we come across many Nabatean homes carved into the sandstone cliffs. Some with interesting outdoor-indoor living rooms, having a magnificent view and natural air conditioning, cool on cool days and hot on hot days. Although the homes of the Nabateans were naturally colorful, they often plastered and painted over the walls in vivid colors, usually bright reds, blues, and white. When the Romans came, they reorganized the city, laid out a main street paved with limestone, and constructed on both sides ornate temples, commercial buildings, baths, and retail shops. They also brought didn't happen in the form of a large amphitheater carved out of the natural bedrock in the distinctive Roman style. It seats between 4,000 to 5,000 persons. It has 33 rows of seats with 3 main aisles carved in a semicircle of rock around a floor 120 feet in diameter with stage, orchestra, and wings for the performers. Box seats in the actually Nabatean tombs exposed when the seating capacity was increased. As the population of Petra increased, at one time well over 250,000 persons. Today, silence prevails, where once the roaring crowds, gladiators. Petra's streets, once bustling with life, are empty. Its homes no longer echo with the laughter of children. Petra's springs are dried up to such an extent that its once fertile valleys are now desert. The rose-red tree, bronze caravans laden with the riches of the East no longer come and go through the sick. Now as our visit to Petra comes to an end, we are reminded of the 35th chapter of Ezekiel, where God says, quote, "Thus saith the Lord God, behold, O Mount thee, I will lay thy cities desolate, I will make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out, and him that returneth. Perpetual desolations, and thy cities shall not return, and ye shall, Lord." Is proof that God is faithful. Once he says a thing, it will come to pass. We can have faith in his word.
Conspiracy, one of the darkest words in the language of man. Yet there is hardly a single page of history that doesn't partially reveal the deadly eye of conspiracy at work. It was a conspiracy that directed Brutus against Caesar in the Roman Senate on the Ides of March. It was a conspiracy that plotted the betrayal of West Point by Benedict Arnold during the American Revolution. It was a conspiracy that led John Wilkes Booth to the assassination of President Lincoln on Good Friday, 1865. The past record of man is burdened with accounts of assassinations, secret combines, palace plots, and betrayals in war. The tenet of conspiracy has been a dominant force in all history. But in spite of this clear record, an amazing number of people have begun to scoff at the possibility of conspiracy at work today. They dismiss such an idea merely as a conspiratorial view of history. The purpose of this presentation is to show that the conspiratorial view of history, particularly of recent history, is the correct view. That there is a secret and powerful combine at work today. That it constitutes the unseen government of the United States, and that it properly can be identified as the capitalist conspiracy. In 1963, the nation was held spellbound by the testimony of gangster Joe Valachi as he exposed the inside workings of the international crime syndicate known as the Cosa Nostra, or the Mafia. No matter how carefully criminal conspiracies are organized, eventually they're exposed because someone on the inside goes to the authorities and talks. The same is true with political conspiracies. For instance, over the years, there has been a steady stream of defectors from the communist apparatus, and through their testimony, we now have a clear idea of how that conspiracy is organized and operated. But one large piece of the puzzle always has been missing. It's a matter of record that some of the greatest help to world communism often has come from prominent and respectable leaders within the United States. Obviously, these men are not communists. As a matter of fact, most of them are extremely wealthy and are thought of as capitalists, who supposedly would have the most to lose under socialism and communism. And yet the record is disturbingly consistent. And Americans repeatedly have asked why. Why have some of the richest people in the United States, both in and outside of government, aligned themselves with leftist policies that would appear to be the path to their own destruction? And if there is a conspiracy at work among these men, why hasn't someone on the inside exposed it? The answer is, someone has. Dr. Carroll Quigley is a professor of history at Georgetown University. He is the author of the widely used textbook, Evolution of Civilization. He is a member of the editorial board of the monthly periodical, Current History. He has been a frequent lecturer and consultant for such groups as the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, the Brookings Institution, the U.S. Naval Weapons Laboratory, the Naval College, the Smithsonian Institute, and the State Department. Dr. Quigley also has been closely associated with many of the family dynasties of the super-rich. He is, by his own boast, an insider with a front-row view of the world's money power structure. When Dr. Quigley wrote this 1,300-page book of dry history entitled Tragedy and Hope, it was obvious that it would never be read by the masses. It was intended for the intellectual elite. And to such a select readership, Dr. Quigley cautiously exposed one of the best-kept secrets of all time. But he also made it quite clear that he was an extremely friendly apologist for this group, and that he fully supports their goals and purposes. On page 950, Dr. Quigley says, "I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. In general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown." Dr. Quigley points out that during the past 200 years, while the peoples of the world gradually were winning their political freedom from monarchies, the major banking families of the world were nullifying the trend toward representative government by setting up new dynasties of political control, but behind the scenes, in the form of international financial combines. These banking dynasties had learned that all governments, whether they be monarchies or democracies, must borrow money in times of emergency, and that by providing such funds from their own private resources, with strings attached, of course, gradually they could bring both kings and democratic leaders under their control. Dr. Quigley believes that people should be more familiar with the identities of these clever banking dynasties. They include such names as Baring, Hambros, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, the Spires, Mirabeau, Mallet, Fuld, and above all, Rothschild and Morgan. It should be noted that while the Rothschilds and other Jewish families cooperated together in these ventures, this was by no means a Jewish monopoly, as some have alleged. Men of finance of many nationalities and many religious and non-religious backgrounds collaborated together to create this superstructure of hidden power. Its essence was not race, nor religion, nor nationality. It was simply a passion for control over other human beings. Dr. Quigley identifies this group simply as the international bankers. These are not the same as the local commercial bankers with whom we deal in everyday life. International bankers deal not with the general public, but with the industrial giants of the world, with other financial institutions, and especially with governments. The key to their success has been to control and manipulate the money system of a nation, while letting it appear to be controlled by the government. The net effect is to create money out of nothing, lend it to the government, and then collect interest on it. A rather profitable transaction, to say the least. For example, in 1694, international banker William Patterson obtained the charter of the Bank of England, and the power over England's money system fell into private hands. In a boastful mood, Patterson said, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing." 230 years later, Reginald Mackina, British Chancellor of the Exchequer, said, "The banks can and do create money, and they who control the credit of the nation direct the policy of governments and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people." Turning to the United States, Dr. Quigley tells us, "The structure of financial controls created by the tycoons of big banking and big business in the period 1880 to 1933 was of extraordinary complexity, one business fief being built on another, both being allied with semi-independent associates, the whole rearing upward into two pinnacles of economic and financial power. One, centered in New York, was headed by J.P. Morgan and Company, and the other, in Ohio, was headed by the Rockefeller family. When these two cooperated, as they generally did, they could influence the economic life of the country to a large degree and could almost control its political life, at least on the federal level. In the United States, it was inevitable that the international banking interests would attempt to establish the same kind of private monopoly over the money system that they had achieved in England, France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. The same formula would be used: make it look like a government operation, but keep the control in private hands. John D. Rockefeller had purchased the Chase Bank, and his brother William bought the National City Bank of New York. The Rockefeller Chase Bank was later merged with the Warburg's Manhattan Bank to form the Chase Manhattan, one of the most powerful financial combines in the world today. Acting in concert with the Morgan banking dynasty, they spent untold millions of dollars to promote legislation that would grant to them a private franchise over this nation's money system. To sell this scheme to the voters, the monopolists created the propaganda line that the proposed banking law somehow would work against the monopolies. Politicians took up the cry, "Banking reform," and "Down with Wall Street." And then, to make it look convincing, the financial tycoons publicly pretended to oppose the measure, all the while financing it behind the scenes. On December 22, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act finally was passed into law. Something known as the Federal Reserve System came into being, and with it, total control over the nation's money fell into private hands. The Federal Reserve System solely is responsible for creating money in the United States. The Treasury prints only what the Federal Reserve tells it to print. The far greater amount of checkbook money is also determined by this group. Yet it is not a government agency and is entirely beyond the reach of the American voter. Technically, the stock of the Federal Reserve System is held by 12 privately owned national banks that make up the system. These, in turn, are owned primarily by the private banking dynasties that work so hard to bring that system into being. By law, the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board are appointed by the President for a term of 14 years each. In spite of the incredible length of these appointments, nevertheless, they're supposed to create the illusion that the people, acting through their elected leaders, have some voice in the nation's monetary policies. In practice, however, every president since the beginning of the Federal Reserve System has appointed only those men who were congenial to the financial interests of the international banking dynasties. There have been no exceptions. It is now known that the original Federal Reserve Board was handpicked by Colonel Edward Mandell House, who early in his career had represented British and American banking interests. The intimate papers of Colonel House, edited by Charles Seymour, reveal House as the unseen guardian angel of the Federal Reserve System. In the words of Mr. Seymour, "The Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns, the Rockefellers, and the Morgans had faith in House." In 1912, Colonel House authored this book entitled Philip Drew, Administrator. The hero, a thinly disguised version of himself in real life, was a behind-the-scenes manipulator of prominent political figures. In the disguised form of a novel, The book lays bare the general strategy that has been followed ever since, even to the very present. It tells of how a small group of insiders cause a depression and then bring about the election of a man named Rockland. Rockland gives fireside chats and launches a program called the New Era to strengthen government control over the masses. Eventually, the insiders who control the government weaken the country deliberately to the point of civil war, which provides them with the excuse for establishing a dictatorship under Philip Drew. Colonel House was the man who selected Woodrow Wilson as a presidential candidate and later became his principal advisor. Wilson was totally dependent on House for all political decisions. He was his alter ego. The president himself had written, "Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. If I were in his place, I would do just as he suggested." When the federal government goes into debt, it borrows that money from the Federal Reserve System. The national debt presently is at the 400 billion mark. Just to pay the interest on this debt, taxpayers are forced to contribute over $20 billion every year. And remember, that is interest on money created out of nothing. At National Convention time, $20 billion can determine far more politics than all the shouting and placard waving and brass bands combined. And one can only imagine the economic and political pressures that are brought to bear on a candidate seeking public office. Pressures and commitments to make sure that if elected, the new president will make the correct appointments, not only to the Federal Reserve Board, but also to ambassadorial posts, government agencies, the cabinet, and even the Supreme Court. This is why, through the years, administrations change, party labels change, but major policies do not. In 1870, a wealthy British socialist by the name of John Ruskin was appointed as Professor of Fine Arts at Oxford University in London. He taught his students that the state must take control of the means of production and organize them for the good of the community as a whole. But he advocated placing control of the state into the hands of a single dictator. He said, "My continual aim has been to show the eternal superiority of some men to others, sometimes even of one man to all others." Dr. Quigley tells us, Ruskin spoke to the Oxford undergraduates as members of the privileged ruling class. He told them that they were the possessors of a magnificent tradition of education, beauty, rule of law, freedom, decency, and self-discipline. But that this tradition could not be saved unless it could be extended to the lower classes in England itself and to the non-English masses throughout the world. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept it with him for 30 years. Cecil Rhodes made one of the world's greatest fortunes. With help from international bankers, he was able to establish a virtual monopoly over all the diamonds that came from South Africa, and most of the gold as well. Throughout his entire life, Cecil Rhodes spent most of his vast income to promote the ruling class ideas of John Ruskin. Many people are familiar with the world-famous Rhodes Scholarships, which were established to promote the less controversial aspects of John Ruskin's dream. But very few are familiar with the fact that in 1891, Cecil Rhodes established a secret society to promote the rest of that dream. Dr. Quigley explains, in this secret society, Rhodes was to be leader. Stead, Brett, Lord Esher, and Milner were to form an executive committee. Arthur Lord Balfour, Sir Harry Johnston, Lord Rothschild, Albert Lord Grey, and others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Milner as the Round Table Organization. Here, then, was the classic pattern of political conspiracies throughout all history. At the center, usually depicted as the all-seeing eye, there is a tiny group in complete control, with one man as the undisputed leader. Next comes a circle of secondary leadership that for the most part is completely unaware of an inner core, they are led to believe that they are the innermost ring. In time, as these conspiracies are built from the center out, they form additional rings of organization. Those in the outer echelons usually are poor idealistic souls with an honest desire to improve the world. They never suspect an inner control for sinister purposes, and only those few who demonstrate a ruthless capacity for higher leadership are ever allowed to see it. After the death of Cecil Rhodes, the inner core of his secret society fell to the hands of Lord Alfred Milner, Governor-General and High Commissioner of South Africa. As director of a number of public banks and corporate precursor of England's Midland Bank, he became one of the greatest political and financial powers in the world. Milner recruited into his secret society a group of young men, chiefly from Oxford and Toynbee Hall. And according to Quigley, through his influence, these men were able to win influential posts in government and international finance, and became the dominant influence in British imperial and foreign affairs up to 1939. Under Milner in South Africa, they were known as Milner's Kindergarten until 1910. In 1909 to 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as roundtable groups in the chief British dependencies and in the United States. The Roundtable Group in the United States promptly created an external organization known as the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. It is through this organizational ring and then outward, through tax-exempt foundations, universities, and government agencies, that the international capitalist conspiracy has dominated the domestic and foreign policies of the United States for over 50 years. Unless there is any doubt as to who is behind the CFR, Dr. Quigley tells us bluntly, in New York it was known as the Council on Foreign Relations and was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with the very small American Roundtable Group. The CFR building is located on the west side of fashionable Park Avenue in New York. Although it definitely is not the center of the conspiracy, and although practically none of its members are aware of an inner control, nevertheless, it is semi-secret in its operation. It shuns publicity, and members are sworn not to disclose to the public the proceedings of its conferences and briefings. It has a formal membership of 1,400 elite personalities. In Harper's Magazine of July 1958, there is an article entitled School for Statesmen, written by CFR member Joseph Kraft. Kraft revealed that one of the chief architects for the CFR was none other than Colonel Edward Mandell House. At the time of writing this article, Mr. Kraft boasted that the CFR membership even then included the President, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Board Chairman of 3 of the country's 5 largest industrial corporations, 2 of the 4 richest insurance companies, and 2 of the 3 biggest banks, plus the senior partners of 2 of the 3 leading Wall Street law firms, the publishers of the 2 biggest news magazines and of the country's most influential newspaper, and the presidents of the big 3 in both universities and foundations, as well as a score of other college presidents, a scattering of top scientists and journalists. The CFR, from behind the scenes, has dominated this nation for decades. CFR members include top executives and journalists for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Daily News, Harper's, Look, Time, Life, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, CBS, NBC, MGM. They include directors of the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment Fund. They include Presidents Hoover, Eisenhower, Johnson, and Nixon, Secretaries of State Stettinius, Atchison, Dulles, Herter, and Rusk, a fantastic percentage of the President's Cabinet, undersecretaries, the Federal Reserve Board, ambassadors to other countries, Supreme Court justices, and presidential advisors. The average American has never heard of the CFR, yet it is the unseen government of the United States. It's a sobering fact that the hidden power structure of international finance has exerted tremendous influence over public opinion in this country through its virtual control of higher education and major segments of mass communications. The human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it. If it is possible to control the input of the human mind, then no matter how intelligent a person may be, what he will think. And yes, it's even possible to program mere mention of the word. Such programming of while one group has been conspiracy at work, another group has been led to believe that communists have been behind practically everything, a position easily made to look ridiculous. These well-intentioned anti-communists have been correct in their charge of conspiracy, but incorrect in knowing who to blame. As far back as 1907, Trotsky was financed by British bankers. By 1917, the major financing for the communist revolution in Russia was coming through Lord Alfred Milner, the leader of that inner core within the Roundtable groups and the CFR. In America, Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb and Company gave $20 million to Trotsky. From Germany, millions more came from Max Warburg. The communist movement, not only in the United States, but around the world, always has been financed by the international banking establishment. Dr. Quigley explains why the establishment has never greatly worried about the communist movement in America. He says, "It must be recognized that the power that these energetic left-wingers exercised was never their own power or communist power, but was ultimately the power of the international financial coterie." In the 1950s, when the public became aroused over evidence of communist subversion in the federal government, it was a simple expedient to have a promising young congressman from California dramatically expose one communist agent. The establishment press gave it extensive coverage, the public was placated, and the obscure congressman became a national hero almost overnight. But when Congressman Reese of Tennessee began to investigate the link-up between Alger Hiss, the Carnegie Endowment, the Morgan Bank, and the interlocking tax-exempt foundations, the establishment press and the administration moved mightily against him. The pressures were so great that he was forced to abandon his investigation, and no one has dared to try it since. After a man has far more money than he possibly can spend for pleasures, what is left to excite him? For those with a ruling class mentality, the answer is power, raw power over other human beings. Money can buy such power only to a point. Beyond that, politics is the sport, and world politics is the ultimate game. For the purposes of this presentation, we have referred to those in the international power structure as capitalists. But these men are not really capitalists in the classical sense. They are merely rich socialists. They have gained their vast wealth not through honest competition and free enterprise, but by political influence and favoritism, the granting of government protection to eliminate competition, and by gigantic fraud of the money system, backed by government force. These men are striving to create a world superstate, with the expectation that from behind the scenes, they will be the ones who will rule. Not free enterprise capitalism, but big government is the conspiracy's life force. World government is its ultimate goal. But what is the best way to sell big government and then world government to a people like ours, historically devoted to an independent republic of limited powers? The answer is simple. In revolutionary literature, the tactic is known as pressure from above and below. It's the strategy that Colonel House laid down in his book, Philip Drew, Administrator. Deliberately create problems, and then offer only those solutions that result in the expansion of government. Create conditions so frightful at home and abroad that the abandonment of personal liberties and national sovereignty will appear as a reasonable price for a return to domestic tranquility and world peace. If those who seek world dominion can stimulate leftist mobs into violent confrontation with local law enforcement, and also provide exhaustive news coverage so that the entire nation can see and tremble, then the peaceful and freedom-loving majority can be programmed to accept a vast expansion of government powers and even a national police force, offered supposedly to end the violence. If those who seek world dominion can raise the specter of an enemy armed to the teeth with superior atomic weapons on the verge of launching a nuclear holocaust, and also offer world government as the prevention, then millions of Americans can be programmed to accept the loss of national sovereignty as our last best hope for peace. This is the meaning of pressure from above and below. To put over police-state measures at home, they need chaos, crime, and anarchy in the streets. To sell the idea of world government, they need the constant threat of nuclear war. Or, as they say in revolutionary circles, the real action is in the reaction. In 1968, Random House Incorporated published this book by James Coonan, The Strawberry Statement, Notes of a College Revolutionary. Coonan carries the usual New Left credentials and is a classic example of the extent to which a highly intelligent mind can be programmed by the establishment into thinking that it is acting against the establishment. Coonan was one of the leading participants in the first student seizure of an American university, which occurred at Columbia in April of 1968. Initially, the movement was not large and easily could have been stopped by a simple police action. But as usual, the anti-establishment forces received their greatest help from the establishment itself. For several days, police were told not to interfere. Meanwhile, university officials groveled in the face of outrageous propaganda charges, and the media made national heroes of the rebelling students. MGM even made a movie out of Coonan's book. On page 130, Coonan wrote, "In the evening, I went up to the U to check out a strategy meeting. A kid was giving a report on the SDS convention. He said that at the convention, men from Business International roundtables, the meeting sponsored by Business International for their client groups and heads of government, tried to buy up a few radicals. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago. We were also offered ESSO, or Rockefeller money. They want us to make a lot of radical commotion so they can look more in the center as they move to the left." Jerry Kirk, while a student at the University of Chicago, was active in the SDS, the Du Bois Club, the Black Panthers, and the Communist Party. In 1969, Mr. Kirk broke from the party, and the following year testified before the House and Senate Internal Security Committees. Here is what Mr. Kirk has told us. "Young people have no conception of the conspiracy's strategy of pressure from above and pressure from below. They have no idea that they're playing into the hands of the establishment they claim to hate. The radicals think they're fighting the forces of the super-rich, like Rockefeller and Ford, and don't realize that it is precisely such forces which are behind their own revolution, financing it, and using it for their own purposes." When Stokely Carmichael was head of the militant revolutionary group known as SNCC, he was invited to speak at the University of Chicago. Jerry Kirk, then still a Black Panther, was among those who attended, and here is how he described Carmichael's appearance. Mr. Carmichael was obviously in the middle of something rather important, which made him more nervous and more tense than in the past. He started speaking of things which he said he could not have said before because his research was not finished. He spoke of the false consciousness of many blacks who believed the Jews were the instrument of oppression of blacks. And he made note of the fact that even though many Jewish people, for example in New York, own quite a bit of land, one must understand that the overwhelming percentages of mortgages in Harlem was owned not by Jewish people, but by Morgan Guarantee Trust, the Morgan family, and Chase Manhattan Bank, the Rockefellers. He repeated the line from the song he liked so well. "Something is happening here, but you don't know quite what it is, do you, Mr. Jones?" What he was getting at was that the Jews were simply one strata of society who are themselves being oppressed by people who were much richer and much more powerful. In the agencies of this power, he cited banks, the chief among which were Morgan Guarantee Trust and Chase Manhattan, and the foundations connected with these monoliths. It was not long after this that Stokely Carmichael mysteriously was ousted from both SNCC and the Black Panthers. Apparently, he had learned too much. More and more young radicals are beginning to wake up to the fact that their entire lives have been carefully programmed by the very people who are their hate symbols. They're beginning to realize that their so-called anti-establishment outlook actually is the calculated product of the establishment press, the establishment communications media, the establishment entertainment industry, the establishment schools. Rich men's corporations publish and popularize revolutionary books and songs. Through advertising, rich men's businesses subsidize revolutionary magazines. Rich men's tax-exempt foundations pour millions of dollars into left-wing organizations. The federal establishment in Washington, through agencies like the OEO, provide weekly paychecks to thousands of hardcore revolutionaries. And so we return again to the basic question, why? Why does the establishment publicly condemn but privately support the anti-establishment movement? Former communist Jerry Kirk answers, the idea is to create a situation where the people are so frightened of the violence all around them that they will throw their hands up in the air and demand, federal government, do something. And the only choice open will be martial law. The communists, black militants, and revolutionaries will never succeed in overthrowing the government of the United States. But unless they are stopped, they will scare the American people into accepting socialism from Washington and statist rule by the insiders of the establishment. This is what it is really all about. In Bavaria, the year 1786, acting on a tip from an informer, police raided the home of a prominent attorney named von Zwack. They seized documents and letters revealing that he was a high-ranking member of an extensive conspiracy called the Order of the Illuminati. Over the centuries, forms of the word Illuminati, meaning the enlightened ones, have been used by many secret sects and occult organizations. Most prominent among these were the Illuminados of Spain, the Gueronnais of France, and the Roshania of Afghanistan. But these were concerned primarily with psychological and spiritual objectives, a proclaimed inner wisdom and mind mastery of the secrets of the universe. The conspiracy exposed in Bavaria was of an entirely different order. The Illuminati was founded on May 1st, 1776, by Adam Weishaupt, a professor at Ingolstadt University. Weishaupt obviously had been a serious student of the occult, for many of its bizarre features and symbols were incorporated into his organization. Weishaupt had been active in the Masonic lodges of Germany and found in them the perfect vehicle for recruiting into his secret order, which he described publicly as the highest level of Freemasonry. The Illuminati was formally incorporated into the Masonic lodges at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad in 1780. It should be noted that Freemasonry in England and America historically is quite different. Its members are characterized by the highest standards of integrity. Nevertheless, it is a fact that from 1780 on, the Illuminati did flourish as a parasite on the highest levels of the Masonic movement in Europe, especially the Grand Orient lodges of France. There were 8 conspiratorial rings within rings, advancing from the outermost novice inward to Rex, or king. The king, of course, was Weishaupt himself, who had adopted the code name Spartacus. Those in the outer rings were told that the grand purpose of the order was to make of the human race, without any distinction of nation, condition, or profession, one good and happy family. But by the time the member had advanced to the level of presbyter, or priest, his oath of absolute secrecy and obedience had become deadly serious. Only then was he allowed finally to see the ultimate goal of the order. It was the destruction of all religion, replaced by the worship of reason, or humanism, and the destruction of all independent governments, replaced by a new world order, a world government ruled from behind the scenes by the illuminated ones. Needless to say, most members were never allowed to see these goals. In the words of Adam Weishaupt himself, "These good folks swell our numbers and fill our money box. Set yourselves to work. These gentlemen must be made to nibble at the bait. But this sort of people must always be made to believe that the grade they have reached is the last." The public record of the Illuminati is quite thin, but it does show that before it was exposed briefly in 1786, it had already enjoyed immense success in attracting into its outer rings some of the most prominent men of Europe. Its roster included important names in both government and finance. It was the most important single force behind the French Revolution. Some years later, an obscure intellectual by the name of Karl Marx joined a conspiratorial circle called the League of the Just. Shortly afterward, this group reformed into still another organization called the Communist League. And in 1847, they commissioned Marx to write their policy statement for the public. It was called the Communist Manifesto. On the surface, the manifesto appealed to the workers of the world to arise against their capitalist exploiters. But it should be noted that the project was supervised by Friedrich Engels, a capitalist of substantial wealth. Marx himself was so unimportant that his name didn't even appear on the manifesto for the first 20 years after its publication. In 1920, just 3 years after the Bolsheviks seized Russia, Winston Churchill declared, "From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, to those of Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, this worldwide conspiracy has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last has gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads." Each year, May 1st is celebrated by communists world over as a day of international solidarity. As mentioned previously, the Illuminati also was founded on May 1st. Undoubtedly, this is merely a coincidence. The symbol of the all-seeing eye is closely associated with the Illuminati. Like many other features of this conspiracy, apparently it was taken by Adam Weishaupt from the occult symbolism of ancient history. It appears today among the symbols of the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, and many others around the world, including the Cao Dai in South Vietnam. Undoubtedly, it is merely a coincidence that the all-seeing eye now appears on the alternate side of the Great Seal of the federal government, and also on the $1 notes of the Federal Reserve System. At the bottom of the seal, in Roman numerals, there is the date 1776. This, of course, is the year of American independence. Undoubtedly, it is merely a coincidence that it is also the year of the founding of the Illuminati. But then, perhaps, none of this is merely a coincidence. Is it possible that both the communist and capitalist conspiracies have yet one more inner circle within the circle that is common to them both? Is it possible that both movements, unbeknownst to most of the people in them, are merely contemporary counterparts of a much older conspiracy? There is much evidence, far more than presented here, to indicate that this is the case. But frankly, we don't know. Until someone on the inside of such a master conspiracy decides to reveal its existence today, we simply have no way of finding out. But we do know that it is not impossible, and certainly not absurd. What then is our response? Fortunately, it's not necessary that we resolve the historical question of the conspiracy's origin. Regardless of whether there is one controlling group, or two cooperating, or three competing, or 4 or 10. In practical terms of what can be done about it, our response must be the same. Conspiracy, as it operates at the highest level in the United States today, rests upon two solid foundations and enjoys the protection of shelter. If we could knock out its foundations, it would collapse, and if we could strip away its shelter, it would wither and die. The shelter is secrecy. The foundations are big government and manipulation of money. No conspiracy can stand the light of exposure. No conspiracy can rule the masses without the tool of an extensive government bureaucracy. And certainly no capitalist conspiracy can long survive without control over the nation's money. Expose the conspiracy. Reduce the size of government. Return our money to a standard that cannot be manipulated. This must be our response. In the limited time available, we have attempted to demonstrate that the conspiratorial view of history, particularly of recent history, is the correct view. Let us summarize now 7 major conclusions. 1. There is and has been for some time a conspiracy among some of the richest people in the world. A conspiracy that virtually owns the money systems of the major non-communist nations. This monopoly is protected by the power of the respective governments and is used to perpetuate the conspiracy's vast wealth by the creation of money out of nothing. 2. In the United States, this monetary fraud is perpetuated through the Federal Reserve System. Although the executive branch theoretically has some control over this system through occasional appointments, in reality, it is the system and those behind it who control the executive branch. 3. The capitalist conspiracy in this country surfaces to public view in the form of the semi-secret Council on Foreign Relations. Its members exercise their control over the nation through government, tax-exempt foundations, centers of education, and the mass communications media. 4. On the surface, the capitalist conspiracy appears to oppose communism. It spends billions of dollars in spectacular military displays of anti-communism all around the world, but never to the extent of seriously harming the enemy, and certainly not to the extent of defeating him. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the conspiracy always has nourished and aided communism both at home and abroad. It does this not because it is pro-communist, but because it needs the appearance of a formidable foe and the chaos byproduct of a managed conflict to advance its own goal of totalitarian world government. 5. There is much evidence indicating that the capitalist and communist conspiracies both are directed by a single master conspiracy which may have continuity with the Order of the Illuminati, which was founded 200 years ago. But this historical question is not nearly as important as the immediate question of what can be done about it today. 6. As for our response, we must begin to dismantle the conspiracy's machine of big government. We must restore American independence. We must return our schools to local control. We must protect our police forces from federal aid, which is the certain path to a national police force controlled from Washington. We must denounce revenue sharing as a transparent device leading to control over local government. We must raise up men for political office who not only talk about reducing government, but who will do it once they're elected. And that means men who are totally independent of establishment politics. 7. We must reduce the Federal Reserve System to a service function of clearing checks between banks only. Merely turning the system as it stands over to the federal government, as some have suggested, will not solve the problem. The same people would control it either way. The root of the evil is that money is created out of nothing, and the insiders could do that today just as easily directly through government as they do through the Federal Reserve System. The ultimate solution is to prevent anyone in or out of government from manipulating the money supply. And the only way to do that is to return our money to the gold and silver standards. 8. We must expose the conspiracy to public view. If somehow every American could be made aware of the facts contained in this presentation, if it were possible to circumvent the establishment's channels of mass communication and carry this message person to person to our friends and neighbors and fellow club members, the conspiracy would collapse like a house of cards. Yes, the hour is late, but it is not too late if we are realistic in our efforts. As Americans, we can still speak out without fear of imprisonment. We can still join together into patriotic groups to multiply our effectiveness. We can still challenge the establishment's candidates. We still retain that remnant of power to regain control of our own government. With divine guidance and with your help, it can be done.
The tape you have just seen, The Capitalist Conspiracy, has been the most popular one shown in the Know Your Government series for over the past 12 years. In the transcript of The Capitalist Conspiracy, we find the following statement on page 19. When the federal government goes into debt, it borrows that money from the Federal Reserve System. The national debt presently is at $400 billion. Just to pay the interest on this debt, taxpayers are forced to contribute over $20 billion every year. And remember, that is interest on money created out of nothing. The time frame for that $20 billion figure in interest payments was 1960. As of fiscal year 1989, the interest on the national debt was $250 billion. And for 1990, that rose to approximately $285 billion. And of course, by 1994, it was far above that figure, since the interest obviously keeps rising as the spending continues to go on. Over the years, the interest costs have risen to be the third largest item in the national budget. Had it not been for the United States war against Iraq in 1990 and 1991, interest payments would have been the second largest item in the budget, surpassing even all military spending. The number one item in the budget, of course, are transfer payments. These transfer payments include such things as revenue sharing. Again, referring to the transcript of The Capitalist Conspiracy, we find on page 63 this statement: "We must denounce revenue sharing as a transparent device leading to control over local government." And further, in the notes to the transcript on page 71, note 38, the author makes this comment: "Revenue sharing is merely a new Madison Avenue name for the old device known as federal aid. Not only does it lead to federal control over that which is subsidized, but the amount raked off the top by the federal government is appalling. For instance, recent figures show that in New Hampshire, residents pay $688 to the federal government for every $60 that the state gets back in federal contributions. Connecticut pays $1,013 per capita and gets back $62. Maine pays $588 per capita and gets back $75. Massachusetts pays $824 and gets back $72. As the dollar amount of revenue shared with the states increases, the amount taken from them also increases by the same lopsided ratio. Even if the process did not concentrate power into the federal government, which it does, it would still be insane to support this kind of political con game." In other words, federal aid, or revenue sharing, or whatever it might be called, is but a thinly disguised con game. By this maneuver, more of our property and wealth is transferred to the federal government, while small amounts are given back to the people or to the state so politicians there can use them as they choose, and we are given the image that we are somehow getting something for free because we get back a little bit of something in various forms. As noted in The Capitalist Conspiracy, much of the material was taken from this book, The Naked Capitalist by W. Cleon Skousen. Many people do not remember, or many people, of course, watching this tape were not alive, when Senator Joseph McCarthy was a prominent member of the United States Senate. Most people have certainly not heard anything favorable about him because most textbooks that deal with Senator McCarthy in that time period of American history refer to him in very unflattering terms. He's generally pictured as a nut or a fanatic or a kook who went around calling just about everybody in sight a communist. Mr. Skousen points out that this, of course, is far from the truth. At one point in the hearings conducted by Senator McCarthy, he was questioning General Ralph Zwicker about his involvement in the promotion of certain people in the United States Army who were suspected of being communists. Quoting from Dr. Skousen's book on page 86, McCarthy then asked General Zwicker if he thought a general who had knowingly covered up for a communist should be removed from his command. General Zwicker said he didn't think that was sufficient reason to remove a general. Ex-Marine McCarthy was quick to react to that one. He immediately said, "Then, General, You should be removed from any command. Any man who has been given the honor of being promoted to general and who says, I will protect another general who promoted communists, is not fit to wear that uniform, General. It should be pointed out that these hearings were being conducted shortly after the Korean War, when the United States was involved in a fight, of course, against various communist forces. Going on in Dr. Skousen's book, we read the details of how this event led to an end, really, of the hearings that McCarthy was conducting, as McCarthy himself now became the individual who was being attacked. A vast amount of propaganda was developed against him, including that of the establishment press, and also including the Communist Daily Worker, which published an instruction kit on how to get McCarthy. Quoting from page 87 of Dr. Skousen's book, it was advertised as 4 full pages on Senator Joe Low Blow McCarthy, his record, and what you can do about him. End quote. 2 graduate students from Yale University decided that they would take a cold, hard look at the various McCarthy hearings and then examine the charges one by one. They did find a variety of things for which they thought Senator McCarthy might be criticized somewhat, but they decided that without a doubt there was a very concentrated campaign to deceive the American people about the actual issues. The book was titled McCarthy and His Enemies and was written by Mr. William Buckley and Brent Bozell. This book contains an analysis of all of the charges against McCarthy and gives a case-by-case report on the people who supposedly were smeared by him, but in fact who were not improperly treated at all. Later, another book was written titled Who Promoted Perez by Mr. Lionel Locos, and this deals in some detail with the entire incident of General Zwicker and what he was talking about promoting or protecting communists. But as I noted, and as Dr. Skousen points out, it was now Senator McCarthy who was constantly being attacked and smeared and investigated. And the Senate even decided they would censure him, although finally when they got around to it they used the word condemn instead of censure. They had a committee which made up 46 charges against him. And I say made up because when this committee report went to the full Senate, 44 of the 46 charges were thrown out. Of those which remained, 1 stated that Senator McCarthy had failed to cooperate with a Senate committee on privileges and elections, and that the second one, Senator McCarthy, had, quote, intemperately abused General Ralph Zwicker. Very flimsy charges indeed to condemn a United States senator. Senator McCarthy was even investigated by the Internal Revenue Service, an almost sure sign that somebody is out to get you. The Internal Revenue Service went over his tax returns, and after a considerable investigation, they sent him a refund check for $1,000 because he had deliberately overpaid his taxes because, as he said, and remember McCarthy was a lawyer and a judge at one time, he couldn't figure out what the IRS forms meant and what he really did owe because of the confusing complexity of the whole internal revenue system. I'm Dr. Lawrence R. Bourne from the Department of History and Geography at Northern Kentucky University. Thank you for watching this part of the Know Your Government series. If you would like further information, for instance, a copy of the transcript, The Capitalist Conspiracy, or copies of other books mentioned in this tape, you may obtain such information by contacting either Barbara Dimmitt at 871-0448 or Carol Maddox at 441-6030. Thank you.